Okay, it's my honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jim Hoffman, last year's winner of the Oscar Causey Award. Jim holds the Meadows Endowed Chair for Literacy in the Department of Language and Literacy at the University of North Texas. Jim has been a key member of LRA for over 40 years. I've always admired his voice of reason and reasonable criticism, backed by a commitment to do the necessary work with enthusiasm, good humor, and often with genuine merriment. He has served on numerous committees on the board and as president of the organization. He's also served on the board of ILA, on its literacy research panel, and many other critical positions. He's been editor of RRQ and of what is now LRTMP, and I have it on good authority that he's also an excellent teacher and mentor. In this context, his research record is humbling. Jim's published over 100 articles in refereed journals. That includes 12 times in RRQ and 7 times in JLR and its predecessor. He's the author of seminal chapters in 3 volumes of the Handbook of Reading Research, both volumes of the Handbook on Research on Reading Comprehension, and the Handbook of International Literacy, which he also co-edited. Additionally, he has 47 chapters in a range of prominent edited volumes, and 10 books. And rather than slowing down with age, he appears to be just hitting his stride. In the last 4 years, he's published 18 new articles, 6 new chapters, and a book. I really have to find out what supplements you're taking. But the volume of Jim's work is dwarfed by the quality and originality and significance. He brings to his work an enormous understanding of the history of the field. He not only asks the regular questions, but he also asks, how did we get here? In the process, he often deconstructs a problem and reconstructs it in a more productive way, which I gather, as a skilled designer and carpenter, is something he also does with the houses he lives in. The central theme of Jim's work, for which he is most known internationally, has been understanding classroom practices in literacy and the preparation of professionals, not only able to support children's acquisition of literacy, but also able to expand their own individual and collective professional competence. The growth of this focus has been clear from his 83 and 84 pieces in RRQ, his 86 book on reality and reform in clinical teacher education, and his colleagues' review of literacy teacher education in the 3rd Handbook of Reading Research, to his more recent work analysing tutorials in teacher preparation programs and the interactions between beginning teachers and their cooperating teachers, and the creation of the remarkable site ITEL project on the LRA website, which I hope he speaks about today. Although Jim habitually integrates theory and empirical research, it is practice that grounds his work, that and a commitment to teachers, children, and to equity, a commitment to making a difference. For example, Jim is engaged with colleagues in literacy education projects in South Africa, Malawi, Mozambique, Cambodia, and Bangladesh. In South Africa and Malawi, this involved local artists, teachers, teacher educators, and other researchers to produce several hundred children's books, many in the first languages of local communities, printing millions of these books and providing professional development for over 13,000 teachers on how to use them in their contexts that might include a class size of 100 students. A prompt we hear a lot is, if you see something, say something. That's certainly true of Jim, but for him it's also, if you see something, do something. Jim writes with the same nuance and clarity, whether writing for teachers or for other researchers, reflecting his commitment to break the research practice divide. Throughout his career, Jim has been a persistent advocate for teachers as professionals and a bulwark against the cultural, historical, and political currents that persistently undermine them. He recognises that solving the problems of literacy teaching and teacher education and literacy is central to the possibility of democracy. I can't wait to hear what he has to say today. Colleagues, please welcome our speaker, Jim Hoffman.
Good morning. I'm still trying to take in Bill Teal's winning of that award. That's amazing. I want to dedicate this talk today to all my LRA colleagues, past, present, and future, who research the ways in which transformations in literacy teacher preparation can be a catalyst for change so desperately needed in literacy teaching. Over the past several years, we have cataloged in the Cite ITEL database over 800 studies in literacy teacher preparation, published between 1999 and 2019. I am in awe of your work. You have brought research in literacy teacher preparation to the center stage of LRA, and I doubt that there's much that I will say here today that will be new to you. I can only hope that my words will affirm your efforts and reflect positively on our shared struggles and successes. To those of you not engaged in literacy teacher education research, but are more focused on literacy processes, the social dimensions of literacy, and policy context for literacy teaching, I hope this talk might inspire you to partner with us to prepare the teachers of today, as well as heighten your awareness of the far-reaching implications and sometimes unintended consequences of your work. We need each other to achieve our shared purposes. I also want to acknowledge my deep appreciation to the teachers, principals, graduate students, undergraduates who have challenged and supported me over the past 40 years at the University of Texas at Austin, and now my new home at the University of North Texas. And to my personal mentors, Jerry, Yetta, Ken, David, Diane, Mark, Morabi, Marty, Patty, Colin, Donna, Misty, and my family, I love you. And I thank you for who you are in my life. Stephen Hawking opened his book, A Brief History of Time, describing a famous astronomer who had just given a lecture with a very detailed description of the cosmos, the rotation of the Earth around the sun, and all of the intricate puzzles that have challenged stargazers over time. At the conclusion, the speaker received enthusiastic applause from the audience, but just as the applause was diminishing, an elderly woman from the back of the room shouted out to him, "What you have just told us is a bunch of rubbish. Everyone knows that the world is really a flat plate supported on the back of a tortoise." The astronomer rather smugly responded, "But what is the tortoise standing on, madam?" And without hesitation, the woman shouted back, "You're very clever, young man, but it's turtles all the way down." What do we stand on? We academics have our own version of the turtle tower for explaining our foundations, and Google Scholar gives you the answer to the question right there on their homepage. I'm going to offer a quote that I will not attribute by name. I can assure you it's from a literacy scholar who is a giant in the field, a shoulder that many stand on, and the words were spoken in the context of a conversation that I was having with Kathy Roller. This literacy scholar stated, I lost my page. Which page are we on? Sorry. This literacy scholar stated, "The problem with you people," and that's never a good lead into what is to follow, "is that you're trying to prepare 18-year-old young women to be outstanding literacy teachers. They're not going to be that. You just need to train them to be okay." She was wrong, of course, in asking us to lower our expectations, but let's acknowledge that her position is widely shared in both research and policy communities, and to a frightening degree among literacy teacher educators. There's a formula for success that drives innovation in literacy teaching. The work of literacy researchers is to discover. The work of literacy teacher educators is to deliver this knowledge to the teachers who will dutifully enact what they are told are best practices. Oh, I see, I skipped a page. That's what confused you. That's research into practice. She speaks for a field entrenched in a hierarchy of knowledge and power that defines what is important, what roles we have access to, and thus limits who we can become. Today, I hope to share with you a vision of literacy teacher preparation that challenges the current dominant model bound up in behaviorist transmission, mechanical, and reproduction metaphors. This persisting model was formulated by our predecessors and still thrives today under the oppressive political climate for literacy teaching. A dominant model that perpetuates the status quo of mediocrity, inequity, and the absence of innovation in the teaching of literacy, to the particular detriment of children and communities of color. I dabbled in history, as you will see in this talk, not in the search of causes, nor with the intent to place blame, but to understand, following Foucault's notions of archaeology and traditions of archaeology, the conditions that gave rise to actions and ideas. I'm not here to impugn our predecessors. Were it not for them, we would not be here today. In fact, I fully expect that they would be the first to demand us, as a community of scholars, to question everything, as we will ask of those who follow us. In my time with you this morning, I'll begin by situating a vision centering on three key terms from the title of my talk. Next, I will describe some of the research we're engaged with that is focused on the connections between these understandings. And finally, I will try to suggest how LRA, as a community of scholars, can become more effective in transforming literacy teacher preparation and teaching in schools through the practice of imagination and activism in the teaching of literacy, and through the preparation of pre-service teachers and research as a tool for change. The three terms I will focus on are familiar to us and have many uses. I will pause as I consider each word to ask you to engage for just a moment in the sense of that word for you, not in its definition, but rather the spaces and the context where you first were engaged with this term, even the person you may recall directing this word toward you. What are your earliest recollections and associations? Oh, there's the right people. That's the quote about it. Go ahead, Mark. One more. Earliest associations. Take the word practice. Just turn to your buddy next to you. What is that word? Where does it come from in your youth, in your experience? 1 minute. Not even a minute. Okay. How many pianos? How many violins? How many handwriting? How many, there was something else phonemic awareness. That's okay, that's okay. Maybe some of you even went so far to some traditional gems of wisdom like practice makes perfect, practice makes permanent, Mark. And practice makes unconscious. Mark is all over the place here. Back up one, Mark. There we go. That's good. I believe that none of those notions, those early notions, really were the versions that inspire us to think differently about our work with as professionals. I believe that we're entering 60 years after the start of the cognitive revolution, a new understanding of literacy. The practice turn is on us. And I led by the work of scholars like Shirley Bryce Heath, we've reframed the questions we're asking around literacy. Heath's landmark study asked us to look at variation in language, practices, and communities, not in judgment, but in appreciation and wonder. She raised concerns around children who must learn to participate in new language practices in schools that may not be familiar to them. She refused to tell teachers what to do with the understanding of variation. Instead, she challenged teachers to become researchers into the language practices of their children and their communities, and to explore the roles that they might play in bringing home literacies and school literacies into synchrony. Levin Wenger, Rogoff, and others challenged us to think of a different way of framing learning from a reductionist curriculum to a view that centers on communities of practice and growing levels of participation. Researchers like Street and Bryant and Barton and Hamilton and many others have taken us to explore the examination of literacy lives of individuals and communities outside of schools. Literacy scholars like Gutierrez and Jenks and Luke have extended the practice perspective to look on the ways in which power, authority, access, and privilege are infused in everyday language and literacy practices. The practice turn has entered teaching as well. The practice turn and the practice perspective in literacy teaching lifts us to an understanding that other professions have long embraced, where practice isn't just repeating to master some skill that we'll use in the future, but practice is in the present. Practice is the ongoing immersion in doing and serving and learning and valuing, as in the practice of law and medicine. Practice is behavioral in these professions, yes, but it's also conceptual, relational, ethical, and moral. To practice literacy teaching is to engage with students inside of a pedagogical stance that relates directly to cultivating relationships, constructing understandings, and acting with each other in socially responsible ways to better the lives of all of us in the present and of a society for the future. In contrast to the drudgery of our childhood notions, in our professional lives, practice is what makes possible. Ruth Bader Ginsburg found that out, did just that in the practice of law. Marie Curie and Alice Ball did just that in the practice of medicine. Their work was service-oriented and rooted in moral ends and a commitment to positive change. We can, if we choose, practice literacy teaching with the hope of making similar powerful discoveries. I must make note here that the practice perspective in teaching is contested territory. The core practices research movement and the high leverage practice communities take a different view of practice, and yet we use the same term. I'm certain that this work is rigorous, conceptually rich, and well-intentioned in its effort to shift from a fossilized consideration of teacher knowledge to a focus on what teachers are doing and how they are engaged. But as I look at this research within these groups and how it is being taken up, I tend to see a focus on behaviors listed and enacted. And as an emerging scholar raised in the process product era of effective teaching, I find these lists look frighteningly familiar. These lists assume too much about the homogeneity of teachers, learners, context grounded in whiteness and privilege. I worry. The EdTPA that has grown out of the core practices framework is a commercialized product mandated in many states across the country and used in many more. EdTPA embodies a surface-level, monetized, proceduralized, restricted view of practice that should be a major concern to all of us for its negative impact on innovation in teacher preparation programs. There's work to be done in coming together as a community that subscribes to a broader sociocultural grounded view of literacy teaching as a practice. Consider activism. Let's try this again. Try your buddy. Where was that time where you first sort of heard that word come into your vocabulary? Activism. So how about, did we get Vietnam? Environment, Middle East, human rights, civil rights, gender rights. How many times did the word activism appear in the LRA program last year? The answer is 137. Well, you might say that's just because Marcel Haddox named activism as part of the conference theme last year. And you're probably right. By the way, can we just pause and give a round of applause for her and that amazing talk? But if you read deeply into the program, and deeply into the program for this year, and probably in future years, you will see that activism is central to our community of practice, as the current program suggests, and as some of the tensions that arose in LRA's conference last year revealed. Most current definitions of activism refer to the efforts to promote, impede, direct, intervene in social and political, economic, or environmental reform with a desire to make changes in society. But certain roots of activism in education are often lost in this conversation today. In 1934, I'm going to take you back, Thomas Woody wrote a remarkable history of activism reaching back to some of the first Western scholars, including Comenius, Pestalozzi, Herbart, and Froebel. These theorists argued for active and direct experience with the physical world as essential activism in teaching. The activity movement that rose in the 1930s out of the progressive movement and challenged traditional education. It was activism at two levels. At one level, it challenged the status quo for teaching as didactic, esoteric, and disembodied. But at the second level, it embraced the interactions of the physical, social, and intellectual realms as inseparable in learning. By the mid-1930s, the activity movement was sweeping the country, so much so that the National Society for the Study of Education dedicated its 1934 yearbook to the activity movement. That book, by the way, is free and online. If you want to get really discouraged about academia and the shoulders we stand on, I invite you to read that yearbook. In this volume, you'll find a rationale for the focus on activity based on the groundswell of attention at the classroom, school, and district levels around the country. You'll find Woody's excellent history of activism referred to just before, and you'll find an outstanding chapter by Kilpatrick, who reports on the systematic examination of the literature on the activity movement, including the variation in terms being used, such as the unit approach, the project method, and the experience method, and on and on. Kilpatrick worked in this chapter to focus on what holds these different named approaches on common ground: child-centered, social, interest-based, and doing-oriented. Next in this yearbook comes a series of critical commentaries, all written by white, male academics at the leading institutions of higher education in the country, many of whom were invested in the status quo through their participation in the production of assessment and instructional materials. Many were the leaders in the field of literacy, including William S. Gray, the father of Dick and Jane, and Arthur Gates, the father of standardized reading assessment in reading and the Gates-McGinnity reading test, first published in 1926 and still widely used today. Reading across these critiques, we find claims that there's too much variability in terminology in the activity movement to give it serious regard. There's no theory guiding this work. And most telling, the movement has the potential to undermine the progress that has been made through research to define the curriculum in terms of specific, measurable outcomes that is the core of the scientific building of an efficient educational system. To my dismay, John Dewey, despite his long-standing position as an advocate for a child-centered curriculum, joined in with these critics. The next part of the yearbook offers commentaries from school-based teacher educators from around the country. Here we find an almost equal number of males and females. We find in these commentaries ardent support for the movement at every level. We find reports of data collected on the effectiveness of this work that documents growth in teaching and achievement. But in the end, the elite academics, some of the very shoulders we stand on today, and the control, the power they were afforded through their institutional status, their financial investments and personal privilege, relegated the activity movement to a footnote in our history books, occasionally used as a straw man, by those in control today to dismiss any potential threats to their system as fanciful, out of touch, unscientific, and perhaps even a threat to our schools and our democracy. Much as we've seen over the past 3 decades with the response to the whole language movement, and much as we've seen today in applying the discourses surrounding the science of reading to silence dialogue and discovery. In the face of the no theoretical base argument, let's not lose sight of the fact that Vygotsky was working independently with the concept of activity in much the same way and at the very same time as the proponents of the movement. He was contesting and confronting traditional psychological principles of behaviorism with a theory of activity that is seen today as foundational to sociocultural theory. In calling for attention to activism as a pedagogy, I am in no way suggesting that we divert our attention away from the moral commitments towards schools and teaching. To ignore moral commitments would leave us with schools void of purpose. Ignoring activity as a pedagogy while just taking up our moral commitments leaves us talking the talk without walking the walk. We must do both together because they are powerfully connected and embodied. A vision that Freire has articulated in his critique of the oppressive socio-political forces in education and of banking as the dominant pedagogical model, and in his offering of becoming more human as an unfaltering moral compass for education. So the last word is imagination. Where did that come from with you? Talk to your partner and see if you can find the roots of imagination, the sense of imagination. Okay, let's see what we got. How many John Lennons? No John Lennons? How about Mr. Rogers? No Mr. Rogers. Gosh, what are you guys talking about? Bob Ross, Sendak, Terabithia. Lots of different ways in which imagination entered into our lives. What if the first thing we asked of our pre-service teachers about to engage with a group of students was not, what are your objectives, but simply, how will your students use their imagination in the teaching you plan for? What are the challenges your students will encounter and the spaces created that will engage their imagination in the work they're doing? I'm pretty sure this is not the typical coaching conversation we see in schools today. Pretty much, we tend toward fidelity in our coaching, and we see things in being done our way. We tend toward just telling our students what to do, or telling them what they should have done because research says so. Or we just tell them to avoid putting students in challenging spaces, keeping them instead in the just right spaces that we've defined for them. And then no one, teachers or students, will ever have to use their imagination. Nor would we as teacher educators be burdened with the responsibility to think into formulaic coaching conversations, that narrow thinking. We certainly wouldn't want, as Suzuki has suggested, to open ourselves to the reality that in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the experts there are few. If we did create these imaginative spaces and these expectations, what might literacy teacher education look like? What might literacy teaching look like? I want to give a little reprieve here for John Dewey, who I just called out for his failure to support the activity movement. In particular, I want to focus on his writing about imagination in reflection. It's a part of his writing and reflection, I think, that's not as often considered. For Dewey, imagination is born in the context of challenges, when what is shifts to what if. Dewey believed that the engagement of the imagination is the only thing that makes activity more than mechanical. Imagination is a way of seeing and feeling things as they are composed in an integral whole. It is the large and generous blending of interests at the point where the mind comes into contact with the world that is moving in uncertain ways. Dewey's most extensive attempt to explore the function of imagination in moral conduct in his theory is his theory of deliberation as dramatic rehearsal. Imagination is kindled whenever conflicting factors in a situation provoke us for ways to make circumstances manageable. It is a sign that impulse is impeded and is groping for utterance. Dewey argues that dramatic rehearsal is the reflective phase of this groping process. In deliberation, we hunt for ways to settle difficulties by scoping out alternatives and picturing ourselves taking part in them. A dramatic rehearsal is then a work of discovery, an attempt to find out by inquiry, imagination, experimentation, what is at stake, which ends to pursue, and what to value. As I read Dewey on imagination and dramatic rehearsal, I'm reminded of Bakhtin's dialogism and drama as interpreted by the work of Brian Edmondson and his colleagues. What I would point out is that all three of these constructs, practice, activism, and imagination, are rooted in expressions of our moral commitments. John Dewey expressed his moral commitments in his pedagogical creed published in 1897 that contained 73 I believe statements, moral and ethical commitments towards teaching, the curriculum, society, and teachers. While we would certainly take issue with some of Dewey's word choices, his verbosity, the realms not explored, you cannot help be struck by his position toward the foundations of education and the set of moral commitments we do stand on. How often do we engage in this kind of work with our pre-service teachers? We're fine to draw on critical theory to deconstruct what exists and how it privileges some and deprives others, but when do we reconstruct and make explicit what we stand for and what we stand on? Teaching is never neutral in the moral and ethical positions it assumes and the effects it has. Nor is teacher preparation neutral, and yet we seem to want to avoid stepping into that space and naming the moral ground we stand on. Nor is research neutral, and yet we seem to want to avoid stepping into that space as well. We demand explicit attention to theoretical frameworks in our research reports, as evidenced by the critical review by Parsons and Gallagher and Associates, But when do we ever demand explicit attention to moral commitments on how, for example, we position teachers and students, and how we strive for best practices, but seldom examine the question of good practices on a moral plane? I highly recommend Ross Collins' recent article in JLR, where he addresses theories of ethics in literacy studies. Practice, activism, and imagination. You could almost frame a pedagogy around these three words, or at least the start of a title for a talk. All that's left is to save the world with rocks. To go there, I'm going to introduce you to our program and to pre-service teachers that I've worked with in recent years. I'll use the term we to refer to locations I've engaged with at the University of Texas at Austin and currently at the University of North Texas. We are in university-based programs where over half of the certifications are awarded from alternative certification programs in our state. We are field-based, intentionally locating our programs in elementary schools and classrooms serving low-income, linguistically diverse communities of color. We are literacy-focused with almost all of our courses and mentoring experiences over 3 semesters of the program offered in schools. We frame each iteration of this cohort experience as design development research, seeking to uncover the principles that we and others might use to enhance the quality of the experience for our pre-service teachers. In our work with recent cohorts, we've grown in our understanding of coaching and literacy mentoring in hybrid spaces, building an activist curriculum, and engaging pre-service teachers in practice-based research. The latter two will be the focus for the rest of my talk. In our preparation program, we have worried, along with many others, how isolated reading is, or how reading is isolated in the curriculum, what David Pearson refers to as reading as the curriculum bully. We've worried about the infrequent engagement with informational text and disciplinary literacies in the context of use. We were guilty, as Nell Duke and as cautioned, of not preparing pre-service teachers to engage with informational text in classrooms, nor as Elizabeth Moje has argued, of not deeply engaging all teachers in disciplinary literacy practices. We had worked in the past with inquiry as a pedagogical stance, inspired by the work of Harsty and Leland and Vasquez, but we decided to revise our mentoring program to be more intentional about and extensive across a full year, 3 courses, and 3 literacy-based practicum experiences. We began with a conceptual model. Inquiry was not new for us, nor was interest. Other parts of the model, however, were advocacy, composition, and argument. We developed a pedagogical model for working within this framework that was used as part of our mentoring. We offered teacher resource materials that included more than 40 boxes of books and other resources organized around topics and researcher stances, germs and diseases, epidemiologist, food and cooking nutritionist, journeys sociologist. The elementary students chose topics to study based on their interest. There was no leveling of the text that we offered other than our efforts to provide high quality text. Our research questions related to the appropriation of the features of this model into the mentoring context, and then following up the next semester in another mentoring context, and then in their student teaching experience with their own version of interest to inquiry to advocacy. Details around this work in the interest to inquiry and advocacy cycle can be found in a report soon to appear in RTE. In this figure, you see summarized some of our key findings from that work. All of these were encouraging findings for us, bolstered in particular by doctoral student dissertations following some of these undergraduates into their teaching. But there was something wrong in this research. Maybe not wrong, but something was missing. First, we were keenly aware that while our attention to pedagogical commitments in activism were strong, the moral commitment in activism was surface level at best and not nearly explicit enough. Second, our pre-service teachers in the previous cohorts were keenly aware of our research interest. We wanted to know how the model was working for them and for their students, and we often engaged them with questions around what they were working on, and what they were thinking about, or what they were innovating around. We wanted our pre-service teachers to position their students as inquirers and researchers. However, we did not position them as pre-service teachers with us in our research. We were determined to do better on both accounts. In our most recent effort, at the college, started in the larger context, we set out to explicitly represent our teacher preparation program as directed toward transformation, preparing teachers to disrupt the status quo in education and to create schools and classrooms that were more caring, more just, more imaginative, and more inclusive, with pedagogies that were more relevant, more transparent, and more humanizing. We created with our students a set of principled statements around who we are, what we value, and what we practice. We engage with these principles throughout the program, again and again, revising them as necessary, and constantly encouraging our pre-service teachers to make and adapt these into their own personal vision that would both guide their daily instructional decision-making as well as sustain them in the profession. Second, we emphasized their preparation as literacy researchers who have a professional responsibility to grow their practices. We focused on principles of action research, design development research, and transformative research, which collectively we referred to as practice-based research. We stressed humanizing qualities of the relationship between the researcher, the co-participants, and the context. In the first semester, the research work was focused on shared mentoring experiences using beautiful books with pre-K and K children. And even though the context was shared, the questions were very different for each pre-service teacher, ranging from translanguaging to audience effects on composition. Over the next 2 semesters, the pre-service teachers conceived, conducted, and reported on studies undertaken in their placement observations. Our intentionality around activism and moral commitment reached into our mentoring work as well. As we shared with our elementary students, we told them that our work together was about making the world a better place. We read The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind and pondered how a young boy can change the course of water and therein change the course of his life and therein change the course of a country. We stressed the literacy curriculum of doing and discovery. We worked in spaces of imagination and moral metaphors that was largely uncharted territory for all of us. Last fall, as I was picking up a group of 3rd graders to come from the cafeteria down to our area for mentoring, one of the little girls looked up at me with this very furrowed brow and said, "I still don't know how to change the world with rocks." And I could tell how much she had been thinking and worrying about that challenge we had expressed from that very first day. I had observed and interacted with her group many times during the study of rocks and gems, and the pre-service teacher standing next to me said, "It's going to be okay, Marisol. We still have time. You'll find a way." Eventually, her group moved from the study of rocks to gems, to diamonds, to the world of diamonds and gem trading and the abuses of people and the environment. She found her voice, a new term, boycott, that she and her co-researchers took not only into their classrooms, but into their homes and into their communities. This same group of pre-service teachers worked with 4th graders the following semester in a simulation around staying on a self-destructing planet to save the Earth or leaving to colonize a new planet with the goal of carrying forward the best of what we could take from the human race. Each student had to build up some kind of skill or role to contribute, whether they were staying or going. Well, one of the students, who I guess you would describe as a bit of a challenge for the group, never decided whether he was going to stay or go. He never took a position. The student mostly focused on shooting things, blowing things up, and tearing people's eyes out. Then, 2 days before the final presentation, he announced to his group, seemingly from nowhere, that he had been thinking a lot about going or staying, and that he had decided to go. He said, "My job will be to use rocks to build statues. That will be my contribution. People on a new planet will need to have new ways to remember things that are important to them, remind them of what they share and what they stand for. They will need statues, they will need symbols, and I can build statues." We found amazing energy around research, growth in confidence and identification with researchers' roles as of teaching. Research was not something added on as one more thing for them to do, but rather it was that one thing added that helped make sense of everything else they were doing. We found important conditions as part of our design principles. It takes a lot of time to do this. The coherence across context and semesters of work, the activity of doing research, not just talking about research, the community and the community's importance in contributing to their work, whether it was the pre-service teachers, the cooperating teachers, the facilitators, the faculty, and even the other elementary students. Just as the program for our pre-service teachers was ending, we asked them to write 50 words that captured for them what this experience in preparation was about. They could write 50 different words or repeat words as they viewed them as important. We created a word cloud and then closed them with the program with them with the most amazing discussion of teachers going forward. So where are these teachers now? They have all graduated. I can tell you that 8 of them, 8 were presenting at NCTE 2 weeks ago on research and pre-service programs. Most of them are now in their 4th month of teaching. And during October and November, I tried to visit as many of their classrooms as I could. And what I was planning on doing was presenting the list of research topics that they were investigating in their classroom. But what I really found out is they're all working on the same research project, and that is how to build a classroom community. In building these communities, they're setting the stage for future work in activist teaching. They're rejecting the behaviorist management notions that surrounded them in schools. They're unwavering in their commitment to transform teaching, to practice activism, and to engage in practice-based research. Jessica's words, spoken to me during the visit to her classroom, resonate with me still. Research is just really what drives my passion for teaching, because it's how I, as a teacher, can change to make better for kids. When I graduated, I had research off the radar. I didn't want to go back to school, but then I got back in the classroom and I realized how much the research perspective and the research journal that we had done should be present in the classroom. And I think that challenged me and pushed me from everything we did in our program to continue to do it and grow myself in research, not only to impact me as a teacher, but to impact my students, my fellow teachers, my campus, the future of education, whatever you want to call it, because I've seen what comes from it, the growth you can see in you and your students. Throughout my experiences with these amazing teachers and our graduate students, I had this kind of personal transformation in thinking about research with rather than research on, about the intersections of moral commitments and practice. I had this moment of thinking about Freire and how reading the world without engaging in rewriting of the world in the spirit of hope leaves us incomplete, unfulfilled, and unfinished. I even revisited some of our lessons from history and literacy. How slaves in the US prior to the Civil War were encouraged to learn to read, but prohibited from learning to write. How girls in colonial America were given full access to learning to read, but not to learning to write. How in the colonization of Africa and the Americas by Europeans, learning to read was promoted while access to writing was withheld. How in the writing of the Bill of Rights, the early drafts ensured explicitly the freedom to write, were revised and to focus just on the freedom of speech. Why is reading safe and writing dangerous? I began to think, is the doing of research by those who are teaching being positioned like writing as dangerous and potentially subversive to the status quo? Reading and following research is necessary, but doing research is taboo. Who are we as literacy educators to withhold research as fundamental to all teaching and teacher preparation? What are we afraid of? What agenda and whose agenda are we participating in? I want to share 3 incidents, 2 moments that have been part of my life recently that have taken me to a new understanding of making the way forward. All involve work with pre-service teachers. The first 2 draw on the work that Misty Sailors and I are doing and engaged with in Mozambique in teacher preparation, and the third one is closer to home. The first incident took place in a fairly remote and rural area of Mozambique in a small teacher training institute. We were debriefing after a literacy mentoring session where the pre-service teachers were working one-on-one with students from the local primary school. One of the pre-service teachers remarked, "My student doesn't speak Portuguese. I can't work with him." Several others nodded in agreement. Elsa Goya, the lead Mozambique teacher educator for the project, with a teaching specialization in Portuguese, was leading the debriefing, and she asked the group of pre-service teachers, "How many of you spoke Portuguese when you entered primary school? Raise your hand." Not one of the pre-service teachers raised their hand. Elsa paused and then asked, "So what can we do?" Rather than speak as the expert on what to do, she positioned herself on common ground along with them as researchers and teachers. She invited them to convoke their imagination in the face of challenge. They were in control, and they took up the challenge. The second moment occurred at the Comparative International Education Society conference, where we were presenting along with our Mozambican colleagues around our work. And the Vice Minister for Education for Mozambique, who happens to have his PhD from Berkeley in linguistics, came in and sat down at our round table. I went into full panic mode. Misty and I had not anticipated that he would come to our session, but our Mozambique colleagues were unfazed. At one point, there was this long discussion about a phrase in Portuguese used by one of the pre-service teachers in a mentoring session, and then a long discussion of correctness in language learning. It's the kind of conversation that often holds back teaching, looking at deficits rather than strengths, expecting perfection rather than diminishing risk-taking. The Vice Minister had been silent up to this point, but he jumped into the conversation around language and said, "The linguist in me wants to say that this student use of Portuguese is wrong." And then he went on into this long explanation of grammar issues involved with Portuguese, and I thought, oh my, this whole project is doomed. But then the Vice Minister followed up with, "That's the linguist in me. The teacher in me says, that's interesting." The clouds parted, imagination took hold of us, and together we puzzled through where that student was in second language and how understanding these puzzling moments can become a fertile context for all of us to work in our practice. The third moment was back at home for one of our pre-service teachers who you've just met, and it was from a journal entry that she made in the fall semester in her classroom. She said, "I was puzzled and confused and honestly afraid around all this activism stuff in our cohort when we started. And then one day, in the middle of my voting rights literature unit, I asked my kids, instead of 'what are you thinking?' so what shall we do?" And this unleashed a barrage of responses. They wouldn't stop. It was at this moment that I realized I was the problem. I was the obstacle. I recognized that the challenge for me was to step in and do with kids what had never been done with me in school before. Across these three contexts, I see experiences and challenges opening to possibilities. I see calling in, not calling out. I see imagination. I see moral commitments to be better than we are for our students and with our students. In my narrow views on research and pre-service teachers, I had become one of those shoulders to stand on that limited views rather than expanded them, taking comfort in sharing what research says, but not allowing others to assume generative responsibility with me as researchers in evolving their practice. In my narrow framework for separating research from moral commitment, I was untrue to my own purpose. I was the problem. I was the one in need of a new metaphor to inspire imagination and reflection. I was the one who needed to change if I ever expected teaching in classrooms to change and become more powerful and more socially responsible. Following Dewey, I've used the space of the Oscar Causey address to engage in a kind of dramatic rehearsal, to co-author a dramatic story in our community, to both radically imagine, and that means going back to our roots of who we are, and advocate for change. I imagine a future when we move to emphasize from the very start with our pre-service teachers what we are morally committed and to invite them into that conversation. I imagine a future when we re-examine our roots in psychology, to reconnect with philosophy, childhood studies, and step forward to draw on engineering and design sciences to guide our research and development efforts. I imagine a future when we, from the very start, engage pre-service teachers as researchers as a tool for change. Not just a callback to a senior thesis, not a new set of readings, not a course added, and not teacher research as second-class research. It's a future where we invite our pre-service teachers to engage with us in that which we are really good at, literacy research, to grow ourselves in our profession. Research for the pre-service teachers in transition into full-time can continue as a tool of discovery, but also become, as Simon and Campano have suggested, a tool for resisting the pressures of a system designed to make them fit in when what we all aspire toward is transformation. Most important, we can't just lay this work on our pre-service teachers as something they need to do. We live these principles, we need to live these principles ourselves in the design and redesign of our preparation programs with our students as acts of discovery and acts of resistance. We need to step away from course boxes and checklists to think about programs. We need to convoke our own radical imagination to engage the world, our work in new ways, outside the boxes that the institution has imposed on us. If my portrayal suggests in any way that the road ahead is going to be an easy one, or that there's a silver bulleted solution, then I've failed. Our detractors like NCTQ and distortions like hard words will be there to fight us at every step of an already difficult journey. We're not alone. We have our LRA community to support us. The challenges we've faced as an organization have made us stronger as a research community and steadfast in our pursuit of shared purposes, to research, to grow understandings, to become more inclusive, to embrace change, and to serve our profession. I want to close with a familiar image. Michelangelo, of course, did some wonderful things with rocks. There's a particular set of sculptures by Michelangelo that are sometimes referred to as the slaves or the prisoners. These works were commissioned by Pope Julius II to become the lower part of a giant tomb that would hold up the sarcophagus when the Pope would be buried. There were over 40 slaves as part of the original design. The project was never completed, nor were the slaves. Funding ran out. Familiar story. 2 are in the Louvre, 4 are in Florence. They remain unfinished. In their unfinished state, they create an image far different from their original intended use. As I gaze at these part rock, part statues today, I see humans fighting to be free from what they were told they were supposed to be, trying to become something more, something different that is for them to imagine and for them to struggle into, something even their own creator could not complete. It's important that these 4 mostly unfinished statues, though they stand alone, were in Michelangelo's vision, working together as a collective in their struggles, and thus fundamentally connected to one another, granite from the same quarry. It is no great stretch for me to see inside of these statues an 8-year-old Latina girl struggling to make the world a better place with rocks. To see a 9-year-old Latino boy taking risk in a simulation to suggest to his peers that he would become a maker of statues, an artist, with a purpose. I see every teacher I've ever worked with. I see you. I see us greeting that 18-year-old person who says, I want to teach, not with, you're going to be okay, but with a hearty welcome and 3 questions. What do you imagine your teaching practices to be? How will your teaching practices change the world? And how can we take this journey together? Thank you. Thank you.